The auction took place on a morning that felt forgotten by time itself. The sun hung low and pale, filtered through a thin veil of dust that never truly settled in this part of the south. Wooden stalls creaked with every gust of wind, and the air smelled of sweat, damp earth, and old regret. Most people passed through this market quickly. They came to buy tools, livestock, or human lives, and then they left, pretending none of it followed them home. On that day, however, almost no one stopped at the far end of the square, where the least valuable lots were kept. That was where the young slave stood. He was thin but not weak, young but not boyish. His wrists bore faded scars where iron once rubbed too tightly, yet his back was straight, his chin lifted just enough to suggest he had once been allowed to look people in the eye. The auctioneer barely bothered to announce him. His voice lacked the practiced enthusiasm he used for stronger men or women of childbearing age. There was no theatrical flair, no exaggerated praise, just a dismissive wave of the hand, as if he wanted the moment over with as quickly as possible. 17 cents, the auctioneer muttered, more to himself than the crowd. A few men laughed. One spat on the ground. Another shook his head and turned away, already bored. In a place where lives were priced like broken furniture, this one had failed even that low standard. No one asked where he came from. No one cared why he was being sold alone, without a plantation mark, without a family beside him. The lack of curiosity was intentional. Questions in a place like this were dangerous. The young man did not plead. He did not cry out or beg for mercy the way some did when they sensed abandonment closing in. His eyes moved slowly across the crowd, not searching for salvation, but observing, memorizing. It was the look of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant silence. His hands were clasped calmly in front of him, fingers steady, betraying none of the panic that should have lived there. And then there was the widow. She arrived late, her carriage stopping at the edge of the square with a soft groan of tired wheels. She was not wealthy by the standards of the men who usually attended these auctions, but she carried herself with quiet authority. Dressed in dark mourning clothes that had faded with time, she wore her grief like a permanent shadow. People recognized her, but few spoke to her. Widows occupied an uncomfortable space in society, no longer protected by a husband, yet still expected to obey rules written for women who had one. She had not planned to buy a slave that day. In fact, she had told herself she would never return to this place, but necessity has a way of dragging people back to promises they cannot keep. Her land was too large for her to manage alone now. The workers she once relied on had been sold off to settle debts left behind by her husband's sudden death. She needed help, not strength, not numbers, just someone manageable, someone inexpensive. As she stepped down from the carriage, her eyes drifted toward the far end of the square, drawn by a strange stillness. The laughter from the crowd faded behind her as she moved closer, the sound replaced by the creak of old wood and the slow breathing of the young man standing alone. She noticed the way he stood, neither submissive nor defiant, simply present. The auctioneer glanced at her, surprised. "You don't want this one," he said quickly, before she could speak. "Not worth feeding." The widow said nothing at first. She studied the young man's face. There was something there she couldn't name, an absence of fear, perhaps, or the presence of memory. His eyes met hers briefly, then lowered, not in shame but in restraint. It was the look of someone who had learned that revealing too much could cost everything. "How much?" she asked. The auctioneer scoffed. 17 cents. You'd be overpaying." The crowd chuckled again, amused that a woman, especially a widow, would even consider such a purchase. One man muttered that she must be desperate. Another suggested she was sentimental. Neither of them understood how dangerous desperation could be. She reached into her purse and counted out the coins slowly, deliberately. Each one landed in the auctioneer's palm with a soft metallic sound that echoed louder than expected. When the last coin was placed down, the laughter died. Not because the price had changed, but because the sale was now real. "Sold," the auctioneer said too quickly. The young man did not react. No visible relief, no gratitude, only a subtle tightening of his jaw, as if he had crossed another invisible line in a life filled with them. A rope was placed loosely in his hands, not tied, just symbolic. The widow noticed that detail immediately. He noticed that she noticed. As they walked away from the square, the noise returned behind them. Another sale had begun. Another life was being measured. The market did not pause for significance. It never did. The widow did not speak on the journey back. The carriage wheels rolled over dirt roads lined with dying trees and abandoned fences. She watched the young man from the corner of her eye. Most newly purchased slaves stared at the ground, broken by the finality of ownership. He did not. He watched the passing land with quiet intensity, as if recognizing it, or perhaps mourning something it represented. When they reached her property, the house loomed ahead, old and weathered but dignified. It had once been full of voices, now it echoed. The widow stepped down, motioning for him to follow. Still he said nothing. Inside, she offered him water. He accepted it with both hands, thanking her softly, clearly, in a voice shaped by education rather than instinct. That was the moment something shifted inside her. Slaves said thank you, yes, but not like that. Not with measured tone and careful diction. Not with the ease of someone who had once spoken freely. "You can rest," she said. "We'll talk tomorrow." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." 2 words, perfectly chosen, perfectly placed. That night, the widow lay awake listening to the house breathe. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt unsettled, not by grief, but by intuition. She could not explain it, but she knew she had not bought an ordinary man. 17 cents had purchased more than labor. It had purchased silence, history, and something else, something buried so deeply that even the market had learned not to touch it. In another part of town, far from the widow's quiet house, records were being altered, names scratched out, ledgers closed. The past was already doing what it did best, hiding itself. The young man slept on a narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, fully aware that his life had changed again. He did not know what the widow would discover, only that the truth, no matter how long it stayed buried, had a way demanding air. And in the stillness of that first night, a secret older than both of them waited patiently, knowing it had survived worse than 17 cents. From the very first morning, the widow noticed what others would have dismissed as imagination. The young man rose before dawn, not because he was ordered to, but because his body seemed trained to greet the day with purpose. He washed his face carefully at the basin, straightened his clothes as best he could, and waited. Hands folded, posture calm. There was no frantic obedience in him, no anxious glances for approval. He moved like someone who understood routine not as punishment, but as structure. When she gave him his first instructions, simple work in the yard, repairing a loose fence, clearing fallen branches, he listened closely, not with the vacant nod of someone used to being shouted at, but with focused attention, as though he weighed each word before storing it away. He asked no questions, yet somehow performed every task exactly as intended. That alone unsettled her. Most slaves learn through correction, sometimes cruelty. This man seemed to learn through understanding. As the days passed, the pattern repeated. He spoke only when spoken to, but when he did, his words were deliberate and carefully shaped. His sentences were complete. His grammar was precise. There was no regional slur thickening his speech, no hurried muttering born of fear. It was the voice of someone who had once been corrected gently, not beaten into silence. Someone who had learned language in rooms where conversation mattered. The widow told herself it meant nothing. People came from all places. Education could be accidental. A former owner might have been indulgent. Yet every time she watched him walk across the yard, back straight, steps even, eyes forward, she felt the same quiet unease settle in her chest. He did not walk like property. He walked like a man temporarily displaced from his life. At meals, she allowed him to eat in the kitchen rather than outside, partly out of practicality, partly because the house felt too empty otherwise. He waited until she gestured before sitting. He ate slowly with restraint, as though aware of invisible rules. When he finished, he wiped his hands neatly and thanked her again, that same calm voice, the same careful tone. No exaggeration, no trembling gratitude, just acknowledgement. One afternoon, she dropped a book while passing through the sitting room. It fell open at his feet. Instinctively, he bent down and picked it up. But before handing it back, his eyes paused on the page, just for a moment, a fraction of a second too long. She saw it. Most people would have missed it, but grief sharpens observation. She watched the subtle movement of his eyes, the way they tracked the lines without effort. When he realized what he had done, he closed the book immediately and handed it to her, gaze lowered. There was no apology, no excuse, just control. That night, the widow sat alone by the fire, staring at the flames. Slaves were forbidden to read. That rule was enforced with violence, not suggestion, yet she had seen it clearly. He had not stared at the book in confusion, he had read it. The following day, she tested nothing directly. Instead, she spoke casually about the weather, about repairs the house needed, about small decisions she had to make now that she was alone. She watched his reactions closely. He never interrupted, never offered unsolicited advice. But when she asked for his opinion, carefully, indirectly, his responses were thoughtful, balanced, as if he had once been allowed to think aloud without consequence. Still, he never spoke of his past. Weeks passed. The house settled into a quiet rhythm, shaped by two people who carried loss differently. The widow noticed how he treated objects with care, how he repaired broken furniture rather than replacing it, how he polished old metal until it shone again. He respected the house, not as a place of ownership, but as a space that held memory. That, more than anything, disturbed her. One evening, a neighbor visited unexpectedly. A man who had known her husband, curious and intrusive in equal measure. He glanced at the young slave with open assessment, the way men did when calculating value. "Where did you get him?" the neighbor asked. "From the market," the widow replied evenly. The neighbor studied the young man's face, his posture, the way he stood just slightly behind not hunched, not looming. "Doesn't look broken enough," he said with a grin. The young man did not react. No flicker of anger, no humiliation, just stillness. But the widow saw his jaw tighten, ever so slightly, then relax again. Control once more. That night, after the neighbor left, she realized something else. The young man had never flinched at raised voices, never recoiled at sudden movement. Whips left marks not only on skin, but on behavior. Fear became instinct. Yet this man moved as though fear had been learned late, not early. She began to wonder what kind of life produced such restraint. Sometimes, late in the evening, she heard him humming softly while working alone. Not the rhythmic songs sung in fields to survive labor, but something quieter, melodic, structured, the kind of tune shaped by rooms with walls, not open air, by instruments perhaps, or voices trained to blend. She never asked him about it. He never noticed that she listened. One afternoon, rain trapped them inside. The widow sat at the table sorting old letters, her husband's handwriting filling the pages with instructions, plans, ownership claims. The young man stood nearby, waiting for work. After a long silence, she sighed and said, almost to herself, "Sometimes I forget what he sounded like." The young man hesitated, just long enough to be dangerous. Then he spoke. "Memory does that," he said quietly. "It softens what it can't carry." The widow froze. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. The words were not borrowed, they were chosen, thoughtful, human. She looked at him sharply, and for the first time since buying him, she saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Not fear, regret, as if he had stepped too close to a line he worked every day not to cross. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he added quickly, lowering his eyes. She said nothing. But something had shifted between them. The silence that followed was heavier, charged with unspoken acknowledgement. They both understood it, though neither dared name it. That night, the widow realized she was no longer simply observing him. She was listening for echoes of a life he refused to describe. She began to see his silence not as emptiness, but as protection. He was guarding something, or someone, or perhaps himself. And in the quiet of that house, it became clear that the young man was not defined by what had been taken from him, but by what he was still holding on to, a past shaped by dignity, by choice, by connection, a past that did not belong in chains, Whatever he had been before the market, whatever life he had lived before 17 cents reduced him to property, it had not been small. And the widow, without meaning to, had brought that unfinished life into her home. She did not yet know why he refused to speak of it. She did not yet know whose name he carried in silence. But she knew one thing with certainty. This was not a man born to slavery, and the truth, like him, was only waiting for the moment it could no longer stay quiet. The truth did not arrive suddenly. It did not announce itself with drama or confession. It slipped into the widow's life quietly, the way dangerous things often do, through paper, through ink, through a name that should have meant nothing. It began on an afternoon when the heat pressed heavily against the house, making the walls feel closer than usual. The widow had decided to sort through the last remaining belongings of her late husband, boxes she had avoided since his death. They were stored in a small room at the back of the house, a place that smelled of dust and old wood. Inside were ledgers, letters, contracts, remnants of a life built on order, ownership, and control. She told herself it was time to finish this task, to close a chapter she had been circling for months. The young man was working outside when she began. She could hear the steady rhythm of his movements through the open window. It was comforting in an odd way, grounding her as she opened one box after another. Most of the papers were exactly what she expected. Lists of expenses, notes about land boundaries, names of men she vaguely remembered, now either dead or irrelevant. But at the bottom of one box, beneath a stack of brittle receipts, she found a slim, leather-bound book, smaller than the others, older. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, the handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, careful, the kind of script taught to women who were expected to be read, not heard. The first page contained only a name, a woman's name. The widow frowned. She did not recognize it. That alone was strange. Her husband had been many things, but discreet was not one of them. Any woman who had mattered to him would have left traces, stories, rumors, bitterness. Yet this name carried none of that weight. It sat on the page like a secret that had never been meant to surface. She turned the page. The entries were dated years earlier, written in a voice both restrained and emotional, as if the writer had learned to compress her feelings into neat lines. At first, the content seemed harmless. Observations about daily life, complaints about isolation, mentions of loneliness that felt sharper than expected. Then she reached a passage that made her stop breathing. "I am still his wife, even if the world insists otherwise." The widow read the line again and again. Her fingers tightened around the page. Wife, not lover, not companion. Wife, she continued reading, her pulse quickening. The woman wrote of a marriage conducted quietly, legally, witnessed by people who had since vanished. She wrote of promises made in private rooms, of hands held without fear, of a life briefly lived in defiance of the rules that governed everything around them. And then the tone changed. Fear crept into the words, references to pressure, to men who had begun to ask questions, to threats disguised as concern. The writer described how her husband's name was slowly erased from documents, from conversations, from her own protection, how the world had turned its back with chilling efficiency. The widow closed the book. Her mind raced. This could not be real. It made no sense. A legal marriage that had simply disappeared, a husband erased from existence. Such things belonged to scandal, not history. Yet the handwriting was steady. The details were precise, too precise to be fantasy. Her eyes drifted instinctively toward the window. The young man was still outside, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked up briefly, sensing her gaze, then returned to his work. An unease settled deep in her chest. She opened the book again, forcing herself to read further. The later entries were shorter, fractured. The woman wrote of being forced to choose between safety and truth, of watching the man she loved reduced, renamed, reclassified. She never wrote his name, not once, as if even on paper it was too dangerous to record. The final entry was brief. "They have taken him. If this survives, let it be known, he was my husband." The widow sat in silence long after she finished reading. The room felt colder, though the heat had not lifted. She understood now why the book had been hidden, why it had survived untouched while everything else had been catalogued and controlled. It was not forgotten, it had been buried. That night, she did not sleep. Every detail she had observed about the young man replayed itself in her mind, the way he spoke, the way he eyed himself, the dignity that clung to him, despite his circumstances. What she had dismissed as oddity now rearranged itself into something far more disturbing. The next day she watched him more closely than ever. When he handed her a tool, their fingers brushed, and she felt him tense, not with fear but recognition. As if he sensed something had shifted, she said nothing. Instead, she returned to the book, reading it again, searching for clues she might have missed. A description of height, a reference to a scar near the shoulder, a memory of a voice that once read aloud in the evenings. Her breath caught. She had heard that voice, not reading aloud, but speaking with the same measured cadence, the same restraint shaped by education rather than survival. The realization did not strike like lightning. It seeped in slowly, cruelly. The young man she had purchased for 17 cents was not merely connected to this erased marriage. He was at its center. The idea felt impossible. And yet, nothing else fit. Days passed in strained normalcy. The widow spoke to him as before, gave him work as before, but the air between them had changed. She was no longer looking at a slave. She was looking at a man whose life had been dismantled with surgical precision. One evening, unable to carry the weight alone any longer, she asked him a simple question. "Were you ever married?" The words hung between them like a blade. He froze, not stiffened, not startled, frozen, slowly. Deliberately, he turned to face her. His expression remained composed, but something ancient and exhausted flickered behind his eyes. "No, ma'am," he said after a pause that lasted just a second too long. The lie was perfect. That was what terrified her most. She nodded, accepting the answer aloud, but inside the final piece slid into place. He did not speak of his past, not because it was painful, but because it was dangerous, because it contradicted everything the world insisted he was. That night she opened the book once more and whispered the woman's name aloud. The sound of it felt forbidden. She imagined the life described in those pages, the quiet marriage, the belief that love might be enough to protect them. She imagined the moment it all collapsed. The knock at the door, the orders delivered politely, firmly, the way systems move faster than resistance ever could, and she imagined the man she now housed, stripped of identity, sold anonymously, priced at 17 cents, so no one would ever think to ask why. The widow understood then that history was not just written by the powerful, it was edited by them, and she, without knowing it, had stumbled into a story someone had gone to great lengths to erase. The young man slept that night unaware that the truth had finally found its way back into the light. Or perhaps he had always known this moment would come. Perhaps every day of silence had been preparation. In the stillness of the house, two lives sat suspended between what was known and what could never be spoken aloud. A marriage erased from history, a husband renamed as property, and a truth so fragile it had survived only because no one had dared to believe it. The price had never been about money. The widow understood that now with a clarity that made her chest ache. 17 cents was not a bargain, it was a message, a warning written in copper and silver, small enough to be ignored, deliberate enough to humiliate. In a world where bodies were appraised like livestock, such a price was not meant to reflect weakness. It was meant to erase curiosity. She began to look back on the market with new eyes, the way the auctioneer had rushed the sale, the way the crowd had laughed and turned away, the absence of questions, of paperwork, of provenance. Even the rope placed in the young man's hands, symbolic, loose, almost careless. All of it now felt rehearsed. Not the chaos of a poor sale, but the efficiency of a quiet disposal, because men like him were not meant to be examined. They were meant to disappear. The widow had lived long enough to understand how systems protected themselves. She had watched her husband conduct business with smiles and signatures, saw how land changed hands without blood yet left ruin behind. Power, she knew, preferred cleanliness. It preferred outcomes that looked accidental. A life reduced to 17 cents was not an accident. It was a solution. She began to imagine the moment the decision had been made. Not in anger, not in panic, but around a table, men sitting comfortably, sleeves rolled, voices calm, a problem presented. A marrier. GE discovered a union that should not exist, that threatened inheritance, lineage, reputation. A woman whose name could not be allowed to stand beside a man now classified as property. The law, flexible in the hands of those who wrote it, offered options. And they chose the one that left no witnesses. Strip the man of his name, remove the records, change the category, then sell him cheaply, so cheaply that no one would wonder why a man with dignity in his spine and education in his voice stood on a platform meant for refuse. 17 cents ensured silence. The widow watched him work in the fields that afternoon, his movements precise, efficient. She wondered how many times his life had been reduced to a number before, how many times men had discussed him without using his name. She wondered if he had been present when it happened, if he had heard the verdict of his own erasure delivered politely, perhaps even regretfully. Perhaps he had been told it was necessary, temporary, for his own safety. She wondered if he had believed them. At night she returned to the book, reading between the lines now. The woman's words took on a sharper meaning, references to delays, to promises that protection would come later, to reassurances that this was only a legal adjustment, not a moral one. The widow could hear the voices behind those words, soothing and false. And then there was the absence, the sudden stop. The way the entries ended not with grief but with fear, not mourning, urgency. As if the woman had realized too late that the system she trusted had already turned against her, the widow closed the book and stared into the dark. She thought of the auction again, the way the young man had not pleaded, how he had accepted the rope without resistance. That was not resignation, that was understanding. He knew what 17 cents meant. He knew why no one would bid against it. He knew that survival now depended on invisibility. The next morning, she tested a theory she did not want to confirm. She gave him a small task near the road where passers-by might see him, a harmless instruction. But as she watched from the porch, she noticed the shift immediately. His posture changed, not dramatically, just enough. His shoulders lowered, his presence dimmed. He became smaller, quieter, less remarkable. He knew how to vanish in plain sight. When the road was empty again, he straightened. The widow felt a chill despite the heat. This was not a man learning submission. This was a man practicing concealment. She recalled how he spoke when alone with her, and how carefully he measured his words when others were present, the way his eyes tracked movement, always aware of who was watching. The discipline it took to perform smallness every day, to accept humiliation not as truth but as armor. 17 cents had taught him that lesson well. She began to see how the price had traveled with him, shaping every interaction. It explained why he never asked for better clothing, never requested rest, never sought favor. To draw attention was to invite inquiry, and inquiry was dangerous. He had already paid for curiosity once, with his life as he knew it. In the town nearby, people spoke casually of the market, of prices rising and falling, of strong hands fetching good money. No one mentioned the young man sold for 17 cents. That was the point. A number so absurd it became forgettable. A sale so insignificant it slipped through memory. And yet, behind that number lay a fear powerful enough to dismantle a marriage. The widow imagined the woman who had written the book, the lawful wife, erased without ceremony. She imagined her being told to forget, to stay quiet, to accept compensation or protection in exchange for silence. Perhaps she had been warned what would happen if she spoke. Perhaps she had watched her husband transformed, first on paper, then in flesh. The widow wondered if the young man still carried that marriage inside him, not as hope, but as proof that his life had once been valid, that he had once belonged to himself, to another, to a future that had been stolen cleanly and efficiently. That night she finally spoke the truth aloud, to herself. They sold you cheap, so no one would look at you. The words felt heavy, dangerous, even without an audience. She did not confront him, not yet. Some truths, she understood, could shatter the fragile balance keeping a person alive. He had survived by understanding the rules of erasure better than anyone. To force recognition upon him might be another kind of violence. Instead, she began to protect him in small ways. She kept visitors away, limited who saw him, ensured he worked mostly within the property, not out of ownership, but out of caution, because she now understood that there were people who would recognize him if given the chance. People who would know why 17 cents had been enough. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal, she watched him closely. He ate with restraint, eyes lowered yet present. She wondered what it cost him to maintain this performance, to live each day pretending not to remember a life where he had been addressed by name, not command. "You don't have to finish so quickly," she said gently. He paused, surprised, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." There it was again, that pause, that careful recalibration. He was always adjusting, always weighing what was safe to accept. She realized then that the cruelty of the price was not just in the humiliation, it was in the permanence. A man sold for 17 cents was expected to believe he was worth no more than that, to internalize it, to forget the truth of himself, but he had not forgotten. That was why he was dangerous. Not because he would rebel, not because he would speak, but because he remembered, because somewhere beneath the discipline and silence the knowledge of who he had been still lived, and as long as it did, the lie that had been constructed around him remained incomplete. The widow understood, now that the system had failed in one crucial way. It had erased records, names, witnesses, but it had underestimated memory. It had assumed that breaking a man publicly would break him privately. It was wrong. 17 cents had bought his body. It had not bought his past. As the house settled into sleep that night, the widow sat by the window, watching the moon climb slowly into view. She thought of all the lives reduced to numbers, all the truths buried beneath transactions and ledgers. She thought of how history would never record this man's real price, the cost paid by those who feared him enough to make him cheap. And she knew with a certainty that frightened her that the truth was no longer content to remain hidden. A lie built so carefully could only survive in silence. And silence, she was beginning to realize, had limits. The realization did not arrive with panic. It arrived with weight, a slow, crushing awareness that settled into the widow's bones and refused to leave. By the time she fully understood what she had done, what she had brought into her home, the house itself felt different. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness. They listened. She had not purchased a servant. She had not even purchased a man. She had taken possession of a secret that others had spent years, perhaps fortunes, trying to bury. And secrets like this did not stay contained. They breathed. They waited. The widow sat alone at her table late one night, the leather-bound book open before her, its pages illuminated by a single lamp. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a low, restless sound. Inside, the house was unnaturally still. She had read the final entry so many times that the words felt carved into her memory. He was my husband, not metaphor, not longing, fact. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the book. For the first time since her husband's death, fear, not grief, tightened her chest. Not fear for herself alone, but fear of consequence. She understood now why the past had been erased so thoroughly, why the young man had been reduced so completely, why 17 cents had been enough to end a life without killing a body. Because some truths were not dangerous on their own. They were dangerous because of what they exposed: lineage, legitimacy, inheritance, power. If the truth of that marriage surfaced, it would not simply rewrite one man's story, it would fracture others. Estates would be questioned, names would be tarnished, respectable families would be forced to confront what they had sanctioned quietly, efficiently, without record. The widow realized that she was not standing at the edge of a personal tragedy, but at the edge of a structural lie, and she was holding it inside her home. The young man slept in the small room at the back of the house, unaware that the final layer of his silence had been pierced. Or perhaps he was aware, perhaps he had always known that discovery was inevitable, that no erasure was perfect. The widow found herself wondering how many nights he had lain awake imagining this moment. Not the moment of freedom, but the moment of recognition. The moment when someone finally saw him clearly and understood the danger of that sight. The next morning she watched him from the doorway as he prepared for work. Everything about him was as it had always been. The controlled movements, the calm expression, the practiced humility. And yet, now that she knew, the performance felt unbearable to witness. Every small act of obedience felt like a wound reopened. She wanted to speak, to tell him that she knew, that she saw him, that she understood. She said nothing, because she understood something else now, too. Recognition could be as destructive as denial. If she acknowledged what he had been, she would be forcing him to relive it, forcing him to carry that truth openly in a world that had already punished him for it once. Silence, cruel as it was, had been his shield. She was not yet certain she had the right to take it from him. But she also understood that doing nothing was no longer neutral. Every visitor who came near the house became a threat. Every passing stranger carried the possibility of recognition, a look held too long, a voice remembered, a scar noticed. The widow found herself listening more closely to gossip in town, watching for patterns, for names spoken with care. She felt as though she was standing over dry powder with a lit candle, praying no one noticed the flame. One afternoon, a man arrived unannounced, a distant acquaintance of her late husband, polite and smiling, his questions wrapped in concern. He glanced at the young man only briefly, but the widow caught it. The flicker of interest quickly masked. "Quiet fellow," the man remarked casually. "Yes," the widow replied. "He keeps to himself." The visitor nodded, but his eyes lingered a moment too long. When he left, the widow's hands shook so badly she had to sit down. She realized then that discovery would not come through confrontation. It would come through familiarity, through someone noticing that the young man did not quite fit where he had been placed. That night she made her decision. It was not a grand plan. There was no clear path forward, only a resolve formed in fear and clarity. The truth would not be allowed to surface, not because it was false, but because the world was not built to survive it intact. Not yet. She began to act quietly. She altered routines, limited exposure, declined visits. When she traveled to town, she went alone. She ensured that no documents bearing unfamiliar names remained accessible. The book was hidden again, this time with intention, wrapped carefully, protected not from discovery but from destruction. She did not know who might come looking for it, but she knew now why it had survived. Because someone had believed once that truth mattered, even if it could not be spoken. As weeks passed, the weight of what she carried began to change her. She slept lightly, listened constantly. Every creak of the house felt like warning. She understood now what it meant to live under the shadow of powerful men who preferred silence to justice. She had inherited that fear, not by marriage but by choice. And through it all, the young man remained unchanged, or perhaps more accurately. He remained himself. He worked. He spoke when spoken to. He never asked for more, never hinted at the life he had lost. The widow realized with painful clarity that he had accepted his erasure not because he believed it, but because survival had required it. One evening, she could bear it no longer. They sat across from one another, the space between them filled with unspoken knowledge. The widow's voice was steady when she spoke, though her heart raced. "If I were to ask you something," she said carefully, "would you tell me if the answer put you in danger?" He looked up slowly. For the first time since she had known him, she saw fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for what the answer might change. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I would—" She nodded. That was all. She did not ask the question. In that moment, she understood that truth did not always need to be spoken to be honored. That recognition could exist without exposure. That protection, in a world like theirs, sometimes meant choosing silence consciously rather than having it forced upon you. But silence, she also knew, was not permanent. The widow began to prepare, not for revelation but for consequence. She arranged her affairs carefully. She rewrote her will. She made provisions that would not raise suspicion but would ensure continuity. She did not know what future awaited the young man, but she knew it would not be shaped by 17 cents forever. She could not undo what had been done to him, but she could refuse to participate further in the lie. Late one night, as the house slept, she stood at the window watching the road. She imagined men arriving, papers in hand, polite voices, questions framed as concern. She imagined being asked where she had obtained him, whether she knew who he really was. For the first time, she had an answer prepared. The terrifying realization was no longer that she had bought a man with a buried past. It was that she had chosen to keep it alive, because the truth, once seen, could not be unseen, and once carried, it demanded responsibility. The widow understood now that history did not remain buried because it was weak, but because those who uncovered it were rarely willing to pay its price. She had paid 17 cents. The rest would cost her far more. And yet, as dawn crept slowly across the land, she felt something unexpected beneath the fear. Resolve, purpose, the quiet defiance of someone who had stumbled into the machinery of erasure and decided finally not to turn away. The world might never know who the young man had been married to. It might never speak his name aloud. But in this house, within these walls, the lie no longer ruled unchallenged. And that, she knew, was how history began to break.